talking about it, I'll be talking about it. Dennis Prager here. Join me this morning at 11, right here on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy and Cindy Hyde-Smith held serve in Mississippi as anticipated, so that gives Republicans a 53-47 advantage and a little bit more latitude for the president when it comes to Supreme Court nominees, for example.
Yeah, and she beat her challenger by 68,000 votes.
You can get brutalized, you can get beat up. That's kind of part of this business. We're putting it behind us. We can go forward, and we're not looking back.
And she could do it all again in 2020, in 2 more years. So.
All right, for more on the political landscape now that it's settled, that was the last race of the midterms to be finished. We're pleased to be joined by Ed Morrissey, senior editor for HotAir.com, columnist for the week. Ed, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Good morning. So 53-47 in the Senate. Looks like, 39, minus 39 in the House. What's your one-paragraph summary of the midterm election that was?
Well, I think red states got redder and blue states got bluer. I think that's what you saw here, and the Republicans did pretty well in the Senate because they had a much better field in which to operate, and Democrats the same way. So that's my one-paragraph take.
Okay. And isn't there still one open congressional seat where they're still counting? That's the last one?
Yeah.
I think there's one, right? I think that's right, Amy. I think there's one still left, so it could go to 40 in the House, which would not be that far outside of normal first-term, midterm corrections, but a little on the high side, but still within that range.
What do you think of Trump's Norman Vincent Peale excesses this week? In Tupelo, he reminds himself that unnamed people used to compare him to Elvis when he was young. And then according to this new book that's out from Corey Lewandowski and David Bossie called Trump's Enemies, Trump says they would say, if my name weren't Trump, they would say I'm the greatest president in history and I blow Ronald Reagan away.
I think that's a fairly bold statement after 2 years. I'm not sure that's I don't think I'd agree with that. I think that the Trump brand is something that has actually worked in Donald Trump's favor, not against Donald Trump. And I think you have to go a long ways to compare yourself to an 8-year president anyway, and under any circumstances.
But, I mean, just in terms of, him having to operate on a different landscape for the next 2 years with House Democrats and also with the prospect of the Mueller report forthcoming, and a changing cabinet, probably at least key positions over the next several weeks would be expected. Do you see or hear any evidence that there's going to be some pivoting of how Trump approaches politics in the last half of his first term?
Well, that's a great question because people have always been a little concerned on the right that Donald Trump isn't really doesn't have an ideological mooring. He's more of a pragmatist, and so he's the kind of guy who would maybe shift around to start cutting deals with the opposition. I think that there might be some room for that in terms of, for instance, infrastructure, but it would involve more spending, which would anger conservatives, certainly, within the Republican caucus. But, yeah, you might start seeing some deals like that, and I think that there are limited areas where they'd be able to do that. I think the problem, though, for Donald Trump, more than it was for Ronald Reagan, who we should remember had Democratic houses the entire 8 years that he was president,
right.
Is that there is so much animosity, I mean, just personal animosity, that has been built up now between Donald Trump and Democrats that I think it's going to be difficult for any Democratic leadership to start cutting deals with Donald Trump without angering their own base to the extent that they might end up losing their own seats.
Well, speaking of animosity, there's a lot between President Trump and the GM of General Motors, tweeting out yesterday that he's threatening to pull all government subsidies from General Motors in response to their layoffs. Do you think that's really presidential? Should he be, essentially bullying companies who lay off workers?
No, I don't think it's presidential, and no, I don't think that that it's an appropriate thing for a president to do. But I think it was completely predictable that Trump would do it because he had invested so much of his own standing in reopening manufacturing facilities in the United States. And so when this came up, when GM did this, which is, by the way, not unexpected, this is something that GM had been expected to do. I knew that this was going to be a bigger story because Trump was going to pour some gasoline on it for good reason, for good political reason anyway. But yeah, the president can't just stop subsidies for electric cars, which I believe was the specific subsidies that he was talking about, because those are passed into law. I mean, that's part of the tax code. You have to go through Congress to do that. So these are empty threats. They're political threats. They're trying to force GM into coming back to the table and negotiating some of these changes. But Trump doesn't have a lot of leverage in this particular case.
One area where he does have leverage, at least in terms of popular support, is the border wall and the approach that he's taking to repelling the caravan. And I wonder how this plays into the last few weeks of the year and the fight over congressional funding for border wall construction.
Yeah, this is, I think, the only opportunity that Trump has left to get significant funding for the border wall. And the irony here is that the major appropriation that's still left that would create a partial government shutdown involves Homeland Security. It's Homeland Security funding, as well as the Department of Justice, which handles immigration prosecution. So this is sort of a cutting off your nose to spite one's face moment if you shut down justice and Homeland Security over a border wall, but it's literally the only leverage that Donald Trump will have left. In January, Democrats take over the House, and there's going to be absolutely no way that they're going to pass the kind of funding for a border wall that he needs. So this is really his last opportunity, and I think he's serious. I think he'll take this down to the wire. We're 9 days away from the end of the continuing resolution for state justice and Homeland Security, and I think there's a really good possibility that he's going to try out a government shutdown.
Well, and why the recalcitrance still among Republicans, particularly as they see the politics of the caravan play out?
Because people don't like government shutdowns. I mean, Chuck Schumer discovered that, was it earlier this year, with DACA. People do not like government shutdowns, even if they like the policy that you're pursuing in terms of that, because DACA is actually pretty popular, too. And Chuck Schumer just blew up his caucus over the shutdown on DACA, and Republicans have done the same thing. The government shutdown strategy is something that doesn't really play well with voters. It's never really played well with voters. It plays well with a small segment of voters on either side, depending on who's trying to do it. But for the most part, it angers people. And even when you have your own president who's managing it, it still angers people. And so it's sort of in case of emergency, break glass strategy. And the problem with it, using it now, is it's been used so often that people are just tired of it. They see it as a contrivance and not as a serious way of getting things done.
But isn't it incumbent upon him to make the effort? I mean, you're essentially suggesting it is in terms of his inclination to play a game of brinkmanship here. But not just him, also Republicans, including almost 24 Republican senators that are up in 2020, and this will continue to be an issue because border security is going to continue to be an issue, that they didn't take the fight to Democrats when they had control and highlight to the American people that it's Democrats filibustering and, by other means, stopping us from securing our southern border.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make that argument without doing a government shutdown, too. But, if that is the sine qua non of showing that you're a fighter, then, yes, I guess that's not a bad strategy to take. But there are Republicans, you got to remember, in 2020, Republicans are defending more seats in the Senate than Democrats are. And
right.
If they get crosswise with voters, then you may end up putting yourself in a position where you don't have the Senate any longer after that either.
He is Ed Morrissey. He's the senior editor for HotAir.com and a columnist for The Week. Ed, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.